everybody. Welcome back to the Science Dispatch podcast. This is episode 48. I am your host, as always. My name is Cameron English, joined again, as I always am, I should say, by Dr. Chuck Dinnerstein, my esteemed co-host and director of medicine for the American Council on Science and Health. And I'm also proud to reintroduce to the show Barbara Billauer, who is a very accomplished legal scholar. She writes a lot about bioethics for American Council on Science and Health. Really intriguing topics that she explores, and some perspective and some insight that I think is often missing from these discussions when they show up in the headlines or they show up in movies and so forth. So Barbara, welcome back to the show for the second time, I believe.
Thank you, Cameron. Good to be here.
Actually, it's the third time because you've written a whole bunch of stories. Yeah, so we talked about all kinds of stuff. But in any case, today we're going to talk about two stories, and the first one is yours. It's called "What the Law in Bioethics Tells Us About Synthetic Human Embryos," which just reading that phrase is a little chilling to me, frankly. But let me read the introduction or the summary at the top of your story, and then let's jump into some of the specifics, because there's all kinds of strange and uncomfortable ethical edges to this issue. So you write, a synthetic embryo can now be constructed from very early pre-embryonic cells without the need for an egg or sperm. These were initially created in mice, and then in April, Chinese researchers created synthetic monkey embryos. Last month, and that would be July 2023, the first synthetic human models were reportedly created. This development throws a moral monkey wrench into the current moratoria on embryonic research after 14 days, but there are more problems ahead. Yeah, I'll say, based on this article and some of the other research I did, there's all kinds of craziness going on. But before we get into some of the implications, can you just explain very briefly what they did here? My understanding is that these are embryonic stem cells. They came from normal human embryos, but they're synthetic in the sense that they're derivative. And from what I can tell, if these are to be implanted, they would not progress through a pregnancy. So we're not yet talking about like synthetically growing people, but there are a lot of applications of this technology, I think, coming down the pipe. So can you talk a little bit about just the technology itself? What do we know about it and how does it work?
Well, actually, I'm not sure, and I'm going to defer a lot to Chuck on this, that we actually truly know a lot. I don't think that the peer-reviewed article has actually appeared. We've got preprints, in other words, what the scientists said they did. There are two groups that said they did this, one in the United Kingdom and one at the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel, which are both very reputable centers, so we can pretty much believe that it happened. And there are actually two pieces to the technology. One is that very early pre-embryonic cells were utilized to create pre-embryos. Now, technically speaking, a zygote, which is a fertilized egg, doesn't become an embryo until day 14 when certain developmental stages are reached. But there's another very scary piece of the technology, and now we have the capacity to retrogress or take mature cells, turn back the clock, and use this technology to create the same type of pre-embryonic cells, which then can be, shall we say, tantalized into maturing into embryos. At this point, there are two issues. One is, can these cells implant in a womb or incubator? So that's the first issue. They've been able, in this case, surprisingly, they were able to get the cells to germinate or to stay alive until day 9. Day 14 becomes the magic cutoff point for human experimentation moratoria. In mice, they've been able to do it much, much longer, basically to the equivalent of half a human gestation. But Chuck, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I would say that two things. First of all, this is not a combination of an egg and a sperm. These are creations using stem cells. So there is no human creation as all of us would think about it. And then we get into a problem of terminology. 14 days when a primitive streak develops in the embryo was the date at which we started calling the process of creating a human being an embryo. Before that, we referred to it, as you said, as a morula, as a little cherry. But these are all categories that we make up. There's no book that says day 14, you're now an embryo. Because you have this, you have that. These are all markers that we've put up, and we've put them up over the course of 40, 50, 60 years. And it may be time for having a conversation about redefining some of the terms we use. Because as soon as you use the word embryo, that sets a whole context for any kind of conversation, which does have its value, but is not really what these creations are. These are synthetic in the sense that it does not require sex cells to create them.
I think that to launch off what you're saying and to look a little bit into the future, that one of the concerns are that we can, or theoretically, we could retrogress mature cells to, let's say, an egg stage. And then using the technology that we have for IVF, combine the cell with a sperm and create via IVF a synthetic or a semi-synthetic, because half of it would be using a human cell, semi-synthetic organism. And perhaps it's the future implications that trigger or should trigger our concerns.
Well, I certainly that's the case. And as I was thinking about it today and reading some more about this, there is a process outcome fight going on here that many of the researchers in this area are not so concerned about the process by which it is created, but are more concerned about the outcome. And then other groups are just the opposite on that. And what I thought was interesting about it is that that's really no different, and this will be a little bit of a leap, forgive me in advance, to the fight about GMOs. Is a GMO corn an artificial creation because it was created through genetic modification, or can we ignore the process entirely and say corn is corn is corn is corn? It becomes obviously much more an emotional and important issue when we start talking about human development, but I think that there's some parallels in there. The other place where I think that you're correct about talking about the future is around the idea of transplantation to correct for problems like kidney disease, heart disease, and liver disease. And it's just tough to get donors for any of these situations. Obviously, a heart donor represents somebody that's in the process of dying. We can do partial liver resections to create a liver donor, and obviously, we evidently have been given a spare kidney that we can share around. But you can see the efforts, especially in the last week at NYU, where they used a genetically modified pig to transplant a porcine kidney into a human being to provide a way around dialysis.
It's interesting you say that, because just maybe an hour ago, something came across my transom where they were using stem cells, or there's research about using stem cells to prevent Alzheimer's disease. And the mechanism that's hypothesized is supposedly the transplanted stem cells morph into brain cells and then prevent microglia from inflammation. And they hypothesize, since obviously nobody knows what really causes Alzheimer's yet, that it's the inflammation of the microglial cells that cause the Alzheimer's. Well, if that's the case, and this is one of the things that's so scary to me, is it seems that stem cell research is being utilized in some measure because it's exciting. Because if the hypothesized mechanism to prevent Alzheimer's disease is based on preventing inflammation, there are plenty of drugs we have now that can prevent inflammation, like cortisone derivative drugs. And yes, cortisone is a dangerous drug, but we might spend our time and research dollars on figuring out how to deliver these cortisone-like molecules, these anti-inflammatory molecules, more focused rather than monkeying around with stem cells. And I was really concerned that this research is going on. We don't even know what causes Alzheimer's. And there are all these leaps on top of leaps. Well, it works. Therefore, reasoning backwards, it works in mice. Therefore, reasoning backwards, it must be inflammation. Therefore, let's use the stem cells. And that brings us back to the original question is, should we even be utilizing stem cell research for any type of human experimentation? And here I make a strong distinction between GMOs relating to even animals, but certainly to vegetables and human beings, because from a legal standpoint, there are all sorts of issues as to when you can stop the golem gone amok. So if you're creating a vegetable that's not gonna stop growing, well, then you kill the vegetable. But if you're going to create a synthetic humanoid that's become a golem run amok, can you kill it?
Right. This gets to the whole concept of what represents a sentient being.
Right.
Right. This is the basic stance of the vegetarian, is that these are sentient beings and it is ethically wrong to kill them. End of the conversation. That's most people go to become vegetarians from that pathway rather than saying, "Oh, a plant-based diet is the healthful diet." So
right.
you can clearly see the problem in where that line ultimately gets drawn, and I think that scientists are going to push on these areas because that's what science is all about. But that there needs to be a conversation that incorporates the feelings of the general public in how these things are funded and what's to be made of the information once it's had. There's always a difference between basic and applied science, and this is you can see from what you've written and just the words that are coming up here that there's a lot of emotional stuff associated with the application that you can strip away if you're simply talking about basics.
Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, please finish your thought.
Looking for answers, either in science or law or bioethics, is futile, because science can't prove or disprove when sentience begins, and law doesn't have any answers. And so we have to, at that point, look to religion. The religions, even the Western religions, aren't in accord on, as everyone knows, when life begins. There are vast differences, and so we have no mechanism for resolution, except maybe political. And that's just, well, I choose to be on your team or you choose to be on my team, and it becomes a team, us versus them, and that just starts chaos and anarchy and hostility and chaos and societal chaos, because I don't believe what you say just because I don't believe it.
Right. Well, there you go.
Let me up the ante here, if you guys don't mind. And it's really funny hearing this conversation go back and forth. And to your point just now, Barbara, about politics, and I'm not going to be on your side because you're on Team Red or you're on Team Blue.
Right.
Several years ago, I interviewed a gentleman named Jamie Metzel. He's an author, and his book I'm most familiar with is called Hacking Darwin, and it's all about the use of these technologies. So he talks about pre-implantation genetic selection. He talks about germline gene editing, basically all of these technologies that allow us to hack human evolution, or hack Darwin, if you will. And he said something that truly frightened me, because I brought it up, and the designer baby question, and I was like, are we really ever going to get to a point where we're going to be breeding humans for certain traits, whether it's for military prowess or athleticism? Or he says, that's actually quite possible at some point. And then he went on in the book as well to make a case for mandating the use of these technologies once they're viable and once they can be used safely. And I said, well, how could you? And in this case, he's talking about we're talking about eliminating sexual reproduction, right? Sex will be for fun and bonding, and then this highfalutin technology will be for producing healthy children. And I said, well, how can you justify that? And he said, well, I mean, we have vaccine mandates, and we have mandates on certain, right? It's not lawful or of course ethical to withhold food from your child or something like that. So based on that kind of a precedent, we could require people to use these technologies. So obviously that's many years away. But the fact that there's really smart, respected voices making that case today kind of freaks me out. And I don't have a very sophisticated way to explain that, but I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts on that.
Well, this concept of parthenogenesis, or using sex only for bonding and pretty much asexual reproduction, and some of the issues that Chuck mentioned, or some of the technology Chuck mentioned, are issues that came up when human reproductive cloning was first postulated. And it is certainly possible today. We have the technology, and we don't have necessarily the knowledge, but we have the technology to breed for a certain type of humans: brighter children, healthier children, smarter children, brawnier children. And the question becomes, should we mandate it? So the next question becomes, for whose purpose are we engineering these children? For the individual, because I want a blue-eyed, blonde-haired kid, or for society because we need more military people? And the problem from a societal standpoint is we don't know what we're going to need in the future. And that's the problem with cloning and restriction of genetic diversity. And so these let's breed for whatever outcome will not just select for certain traits, but it will also deselect for certain traits. And those traits may be precisely the ones that we will need in the future. But because we don't know what the future is going to require of us, we can't so plan. So while maybe 50 years ago we might decide that we need to breed a generation of Einsteins or physicists or people who have particular acumen in physics or cosmology, it turns out we don't need that now so much as we might need people with an acumen in biology, genetics, or artificial intelligence. That's just on the simple level. On the more complex level, by selecting for certain traits and deselecting for others, we don't even know what we're going to be deselecting for. And those traits we're deselecting for might be the very ones that we will need to survive from a physical standpoint.
That's the entire point. One of the problems that we have sitting here in the present and looking back at the past is we create a very nice tale to explain how things happened. For instance, when we talk about people with sickle cell anemia, that is a very useful trait to have if you're living in Africa. It
Right.
is not such a useful trait if you're living in the U.S. So the story that we've told is that trait developed in Africa and served a very important preventative function at that time. But in point of fact, that gets back to the intelligent designer concept. It could very well have been that sickle cell the genetics of sickle cell anemia were just there. And with the rise of malaria, it began to select more humans with that trait than others. And I think we take on a task that we are poorly suited for by when we start to say we're going to want to look for this gene or that gene, because in fact we really know very little about how genetics really works. It's taken a millennium to get to where we are, and it's the height of hubris to think that over the next 5 or 10 years we can buff things up a bit.
And I think that's the operative word, is hubris, because we think we're going to deselect for diseases. And if we only decided to have healthy children, we never would have had Stephen Hawking's or Charles Steinmetz. There's a Nobel Prize winner in biology who's dyslexic. We never would have had many people who are not, putting quotes, perfectly healthy, and who've made objectively valuable contributions, let alone the, I would say, spiritual or soulful contributions that adults that I've met who are retarded contribute from a sociological or from a societal bonding perspective. But the other thing is when we make these decisions or allow some group, some that's in power, to decide whether or not to mandate a particular category, that group will decide based on their own conception of what is good and valuable and their own conception of what is safe. So this is a colloquy that happened when I was discussing this issue at a seminar on human reproductive cloning. And I was saying that we're not sure it's safe. And some doctor said, of course it's safe. All you do is take a drop of blood from your finger and it's perfectly safe. And from a male standpoint, maybe it is perfectly safe. But the research is that the female that is gestating the clone, that clone is usually or often a third bigger, fatter, and heavier than a normal clone. So if you have a 9-pound, or let's say fetus that's about to be given birth to, that fetus may end up being 15 or 16 pounds. And that's dangerous for the mother. But from this male perspective, he didn't even consider it.
I hear you.
That's, as we wrap up here, that's really fascinating, Barbara. And I think it goes to, this is just anecdotal, but my experience working with a lot of academics over the years is that they tend to be Pollyannas in some important ways. And the best example I can think of, I didn't work with any of these people, but the physicists involved with the Manhattan Project and developing nuclear weapons, after everything was done, after the project was done, after the bomb had been delivered, the rationale for what they were doing started to come out, right? You started to have this armchair quarterbacking about whether it was acceptable to bomb Japan and so forth. And some of the people involved in that project said, well, it was a really exciting scientific project. And we were trying to demonstrate to these politicians that, we've given you this ultimate weapon. So now you don't have to use it. And again, hindsight is 2020. But looking back, I was like, well, that's just an idiotic rationale. You're going to give people that run the world a weapon that can obliterate their opponents in a war, right? So and all that to say, it seems like we kind of have the same situation here, where you have the people that are capable of utilizing the technology that don't seem to comprehend the risk-benefit calculation that a physician regularly considers or an ethicist regularly considers, right? And Chuck, you can speak to this, right? Before you perform a procedure on someone or you give them a drug, you go, okay, well, is this going to work? And, what's going to happen afterwards? And I think, and again, maybe I'm just off my rocker here, but it seems like that's the sort of calculus that we're not fully considering. And maybe we can't because we don't know how the technology works perfectly yet. What do you guys think?
Well, I would agree. I mean, that was another one of these things that was shadowing this conversation was the whole Oppenheimer movie. And we tell ourselves the stories that make us comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that any of the people that were involved in the Manhattan Project did not realize that this was they were designing a weapon. And nor do I think that any of them didn't think that this was some of the most exciting physics that could ever be done. And then depending upon how they viewed the outcome of their research, I think they told themselves the stories that they needed to hear so that they could sleep through the night. And I think that's an all too human quality. I think that that's going to be the same with this somewhere down the line.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to tell ourselves the story that we need to hear. Though again, as Cameron points out, there is a wide difference between basic and applied science, and the application of science is infrequently performed by the scientists. And I don't think we've ever really allowed the practitioners to jump in and speak. Very frequently, instead of the practitioners making the decisions, it goes to the politicians acting on our behalf. And they're in the position to know the least about what to do.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and I don't mean to insult anybody, but it just troubles me the way that some people, not everybody, the way that they talk about this. And there's an assumption that I often hear, like I've written a little bit about this, Barbara, maybe you run into this criticism too, is that this is navel gazing. Other people are going to use this technology. And so what we need to do is we need to have an open-ended conversation, and we need everybody's perspectives as we move forward with these grand revolutionary projects. And my initial response is like, well, hold on, pump the brakes, pal, because for all the reasons we've been discussing, we don't know what's going to happen here. And it irritates me that people would sneak their assumptions into an argument like this, because what they're implying is like, yeah, we're going to let you talk, but really this is moving forward and we got to beat China. And, so say your piece and then leave us alone to do what we need to do to change the world. That's the implication I get. And it frankly irritates me.
I don't think that the politicians who are the people who make the decisions, I mean, the mandate decision is made by the politician, have any of the tools that are needed to reach a resolution. And be they legal tools, be they understanding of the science involved, be they understanding religion or ethics, and I put that in the same bucket, they're just parroting the voices that echo their own idiosyncratic, ego-driven result, or that of their constituents if they want to get elected. And so we don't have it's not like we have a constitution we can go back to and say, well, the Constitution says such and such, and you can argue about what the Constitution says, or we have a Bible that says such and such, and you can argue about. We don't have any mechanism to help us make these decisions other than the knowledge that, as Chuck says, we don't know the future. And to think we can make decisions that will impact the future, especially if they're limiting decisions, is dangerous. And recognizing danger is something that needs to be done. And I mean, for these stem cell scientists who want to do this hematopoietic transplantation to treat Alzheimer's disease, to me, that was very freaky. That was very, very scary, because they don't even know what causes Alzheimer's disease. So, as I said, we have an imperfect mechanism that is going to decide whether we can use these new synthetic cells, in what way we can use them, whether we can experiment on them beyond the 14-day moratorium. And the other thing that fascinated me was in the articles that I read and that Chuck sent me, and they interviewed Hank Greeley, who I know, and he's talking about whether these cells are subject to the 14-day moratorium. We're not allowed to experiment after 14 days, which is a very valuable point, but there are other issues involved, such as, will we let these cells be used to clone human organs? Forget humans, human organs, human tissues. So there are a lot of issues that haven't even been raised. I haven't seen those issues even been raised in the context of the scientific or the ethical debate. The only place I've seen it raised is in science fiction. And I think probably the science fiction authors have the best handle on how to deal with it, because they can conceive of futures that the rest of society cannot.
Fascinating stuff. It's crazy. Barbara, if you're open to it, I'd love to have you back, because I think we're only starting to scratch the surface of all of these ethical and moral issues. And I'd love to get into those, because there's a lot of related subjects here that aren't strictly speaking scientific, but they have to be addressed if we're gonna really get to the bottom of this. So why don't we have you back? And in the meantime, let's move on to our second story so we can wrap up the show for the week. And this is an article that I wrote just a couple days ago. And this is called Painkiller, Netflix miniseries tells shameless lies about opioids. And this is my first foray into this topic, really. I've been following it loosely for years, just because our colleague, Dr. Josh Bloom, has been screaming from the rooftops about the fentanyl epidemic and the way the federal government regulates prescription opioids. And I've been reading that with interest, but I never really got into the discussion. But then I watched this show on Netflix, and it's more or less it's a history of the opioid epidemic. And the way that the show is framed, the premise is there's this pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma, run by the Sackler family, and they developed this opioid called OxyContin, and they lied about how addictive it was. They pushed it on doctors, they pushed it on pharmacies, they had an aggressive sales team, and they flooded the market with it, even though they knew there was too much available. And as a result, you had all of these people who went to their doctors with, broken bones or back injuries. They were prescribed OxyContin, and pretty soon they're heroin addicts, basically. And I mean, this is the essence of the show. And Chuck, you can weigh in on this with much more authority than I can. But I looking at the research I did for this article and talking to Josh and talking to some other folks with the relevant expertise, this drove me absolutely bananas that such a complex public health issue like this would be so seriously oversimplified. And maybe the most troublesome part is that it's a really well-made show. I mean, Matthew Broderick of Ferris Bueller's Day Off fame is the star, plays Richard Sackler. And then you have other actors that are very talented, and they tell a compelling story. But in this case, that scares me because they're telling a narrative that's frankly false in some fundamental ways. And so, Chuck, maybe we can start there. I don't know if you watched the show, but I mean, to the opioid epidemic overall, I mean, how do you feel about how the media?
I've not watched the show. I will say that I watched Dope Sick, and I will say that there's been definite internal differences between Josh and I about Dope Sick, and I don't think they're going to be a whole lot different when you start talking about Painkiller. I think the Sacklers engaged in very bad business practices that were particularly successful to their bottom line. I found that, again, in Dope Sick, that the characterization of the drug reps and how the drug reps were being paid and incentivized was completely accurate. I have no problem at all with any of that. My problem comes at two places. First, this is entertainment disguised in part as a documentary, and I think that that's misleading and really needs to be addressed. And second, as you suggested, I think that it simplifies a much larger problem was there because even though we love narratives, we like to have a villain, and we certainly don't want to turn around and see ourselves as carrying any blame or any of the other usual suspects. They're all pointing their finger at the Sacklers because that means we won't observe them as closely. So let me take on the entertainment part first. I listened this morning to a CNN interview with the producer of the show, and he says he's required to put a disclaimer at the beginning of the show saying that while this is based on true events, much of the dialogue and so on and so forth is fictionalized. And he decided to do that through that introductory piece that you mentioned, where there's a real live human being talking about how this tragedy has affected them and their family. And he's done a very skillful job of letting our emotional response to this very human tragedy for the person that we're looking at override the messages that this is fiction. And that's misleading. And while it's great art, it's not great public health. Let me just stop at that point for a minute.
Well, I mean, let's get into that for a second, because there's a lot of implications, and none of this that I'm about to say is explicitly stated in Painkiller, but the implication from an introduction like that is, stuff you're about to see and hear didn't actually happen, but this guy and this lady right here, they lost their teenage son to OxyContin. So with that, we have the license to dramatize this story. I think that's the immediate implication of that disclaimer. Of course, while they're giving themselves legal cover for effectively lying, that really bugs me. But as you said, right, this is an emotional response to a very, very serious issue, and it can be turned around too, right? Instead of talking about people who overdosed on OxyContin, we could talk about people who were denied pain medication because they have a real medical condition, and then they went out and got heroin that was laced with fentanyl, and now they're dead. Or they just decided to kill themselves because they couldn't live in their excruciating pain, right? So we could play that card any way we want. I think that's what frustrates me is that while I understand the need to tell a compelling story and to hook your audience into the narrative that you're trying to promote, there's got to be a line where you just say, this is too dishonest. This is too much gerrymandering with the story, if you will. There's got to be a limit somewhere, I suppose.
From the point of view of art, you need to have a very sympathetic victim, and you need to have a very evil villain. That's classic storytelling. Let's take an alternative approach to this conversation. Let's say that, in fact, that what we're witnessing with the opioid epidemic is deaths of despair, because people, especially the people in the Great Middle, which is far more rural than the edges of the country, have found that their civic life has been hollowed out, that their chance for advancement in terms of employment are not there, and they're depressed and they are in despair. In that case, along comes a drug that is available to them through diversion, because there's no doubt that a lot of these medications were diverted from prescriptions for patients with pain to this whole area of recreational use. So that's a different tale. And when you rephrase the tale that way, well, now all of a sudden we have to start looking at how the population has shifted, why people are leaving the rural areas, why there are no meaningful jobs any longer in these areas, and those are far harder issues to deal with. And there's no simple villain to put there. And when you look at the opioid deaths, you're going to find that the age group of this group is older than one might expect from 15, 20, 30 years ago. These deaths are not the deaths of young people. This is not the deaths of 25-year-olds. These are the deaths of 35, 45-year-old people. That's why they're the deaths of despair, because they're in midlife and see that there's nothing left. There's no way to grow in there. At least that would be part of the argument that I would make.
Just in passing, I want to get back to that, but in passing, I think what's amusing is the way the story is told, or at least the medium. So Netflix doesn't have advertisements yet, but I'm watching Dope Sick now after seeing Painkiller. I'm kind of intrigued to see how this narrative has developed over the last decade or so. And on the commercial breaks on Dope Sick, almost, I want to say 60% of the advertisements are for pharmaceutical drugs, eczema medications and generic Viagra and all sorts of medical conditions. And I'm not attacking people who need those drugs or the companies that make them, but there's a certain cynicism, it seems to me, in telling a story about the deep corruption of the pharmaceutical industry. And again, Purdue did bad stuff. That's not in dispute here. They were fined over $8 billion. The company was dismantled, and the Sackler name has been destroyed for all of the remaining of history. And I think there's a justifiable argument that was totally acceptable, that response. Nevertheless, the industry that you are decrying as Hulu or as Netflix or as the makers of these shows is still sponsored by the industry that you're attacking as this great cultural Satan. I just find that kind of fascinating. Chuck, what do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. It's, there's, well, I'm in that age group that gets bombarded with pharmaceutical commercials day in and day out, unless I'm getting the whole life commercials there. So for sure that there is a disconnect between what the media presents and where the media gets its funding. And they don't think that it's a particular problem for them.
So I want to go back. That was a diversion. No pun intended. But I want to go back to this idea that the influence or the role OxyContin played in the epidemic. So some of the research I cited here, and one of the articles was from the Yale Law and Policy Review. This is by an epidemiologist. And one of the points he made is that by 2001, OxyContin was authorized, or it was originally commercialized in 1996. So he points out that by 2001, only 9% of non-medical opioid users had reported using OxyContin in their lifetime. And then as we now know, the years gone by, the regulations have severely limited prescribing. And as we pointed out on the show, Chuck, the DEA now controls the amount of prescription opioids that can be manufactured every year. So we know that these deaths now are from illicit drugs, mostly fentanyl and its analogs. So what's your take on that? I've seen a lot of studies like this where they say, there isn't a clear correlation between the amount of opioid prescribing by doctors and overdose death. So what's your take on that? Because you, in many ways, were right in the middle of this.
There isn't. There's, it was a convenient narrative to say that these drugs were overprescribed and led to addictions that could not be addressed. And I think to some degree, there is some truth to that. If a doctor is told that the drug has little or no addictive potential, then they're going to be a little bit more inclined to prescribe it to people that may not really require an opioid, but can't hurt, so why not? But that does not mean that the doctor's off the hook, because they have an obligation to understand the drugs that they're prescribing, even if it's a new drug. And having been on the receiving end of drug information, and in all fairness, having a wife who for several years was on the delivery end of giving drug information, I will tell you that in those doctor visits, the reps always left behind an article or two to support their position, that had been written up in some peer-reviewed journal, and they made multiple copies, and they shared it. So there's still a responsibility on the part of the physician to understanding what they're prescribing. And we do a very bad job, as it turns out, I think, of requiring doctors to keep up with the changing medications that we make use of. I'm an old doc, so Demerol and Vistaril were the drugs that we used for pain management when I was in my training. And my training in terms of drug management, and I think that this was more the case for everybody, came from the resident 1 year or 2 years ahead of me. It didn't come from a pharmacology professor explaining how to use the drug. It was in practical, on-the-job training, saying this is the combination of drugs we use. This is how we write it. So, okay, good to know, and go from there. We don't have any way for when we introduce new drugs to determine that there is a basic underlying understanding and competence among physicians to use it. We take a very different approach when we start talking about the use of medical devices, especially the ones that we implant. If I want to put in a stent graft, I have to go through a training program and demonstrate some competence, at least to my local hospital, before I can go ahead and willy-nilly do it. Not so with an antibiotic.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. So maybe if I'm hearing you correctly, as new drugs come on the market, there should be some kind of protocol to make sure that doctors know why they're prescribing it and how much they're prescribing, and perhaps how to
Right.
see signs of abuse before they give it to
Right.
someone. Is
Right.
that what? Okay.
I would do that. And again, when you talk about the drug problem, you look at um, the distributors. The distributors of these narcotics had systems built that should have told them that a town of 3,000 people did not need 300,000 doses of OxyContin. And they have a legal requirement to report that, and they didn't. So there's some other players in there that are more than happy to be very, very quiet now as they continue to go after the deepest of the pockets, in this case, Purdue.
One other thing. Again, this is another topic where we could talk for hours, but nobody wants to do that today. So final thing, Chuck. What was the FDA's role in all this? Because both Painkiller and Dopesick make the point that the medical reviewer on OxyContin, his name was Curtis Wright. They both point out that initially he was very skeptical of the application, and he had questions about why they had packed so much oxycodone into a single pill, and he just didn't think they had made a compelling case that this drug should have been authorized. And then, over time, Purdue kind of massaged their relationship, and they buttered him up, and they made him feel important. And then after the drug was approved a couple of years later, apparently he went to work for Purdue Pharma. And so the implication of this storyline is the FDA is an utterly captured organization. They're not looking out for you. They're looking out for the pharmaceutical industry that they're supposed to be regulating. I'm wondering, where's the truth and where's the fiction in that narrative?
Oh, I think that there's a significant amount of truth to the idea that many of our regulatory institutions have been captured by the people that they regulate. It's not simply the FDA. So I wouldn't surprise me that there was some initial reluctance, and that they then focused a very significant lobbying effort that does not require money. It requires sitting down and talking and developing a relationship, and addressing each of the concerns and issues over time. It's a negotiation. And I think that that's that's probably indeed the case, but that's the case in many other areas. And we don't seem to be necessarily as concerned about it there. My favorite example is the 737 Maxes. And Boeing had definitely performed a regulatory capture of the FAA. Those planes should never, ever have been put in the air. But, the work between the FAA and Boeing was such that it was a smile and a nod and a wink, and out they went, and 500-600 people were killed before those planes were pulled from use. Another example, same idea.
Yeah, it's really troubling as someone who flies on a plane occasionally. It's, I guess, again, no great answer, but I guess the point for us, as usually is, Chuck, is, go into a show like this with your eyes open, enjoy it. And I did. There were parts of the show I really enjoyed. I frankly found Matthew Broderick sort of likable as an antagonist. I was like, this guy, I kind of dig this, right? In the context of this story. In real life, he's an awful human being. Don't get me wrong. Nevertheless, we just have to be aware that the people that tell us stories or give us information that is supposedly factual isn't always. And maybe we'll be better off if we all recognize that. Okay, everyone. Well, with that, we're gonna land the plane, and we will be back next week for episode 49. I want to extend very special thanks to Barbara Billauer for joining us. Barbara, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and again, no settled issues, but it was a great conversation. Nevertheless.
Thanks a lot for having me, Cameron. I really enjoyed being here.
Yes, our pleasure. All right. Well, Chuck and I will be back next week, pending no plane crashes or other major life events. And thank you to you always for listening. We'll see you then.